Thanks, Scotty, and good afternoon, everyone. And on behalf of the Board of Directors and members of the Canadian American Business Council, I would like to welcome you to the second virtual town hall on corporate action on social justice. After we had the first town hall back in July, I remember thinking what an opportunity we're witnessing as we had both corporate America and Canada engaged in talking about the issue of systemic anti-Black racism. It wasn't just the CABC that was doing this, but all sorts of organizations and leaders were having this important conversation. I took a lot of pride in that day, but knew that this couldn't be a one and done type of event. And as we are still witnessing, with the continued protests and new ones erupting, and the action that we're seeing by the different sports leagues, the struggle for a level playing field continues, and we must have the active participation of the business community if we are to see an end to anti-Black systemic racism and give opportunity to the generations that follow us. Which is why we're gathering once again today, to keep that conversation going and to share in our experiences and knowledge. So without further ado, please welcome back a very dear friend of the CABC's, an Emmy-winning anchor and correspondent, and someone whose integrity, frankness, and experience make her the perfect person to once again moderate our discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, Jeanne Meserve.
Gary, thank you so much. Scotty, thanks for your kind words as well. Let me quickly turn to our panelists. We have with us here today Clint Odom. Clint is one of those who joined us for our earlier discussion. He's Senior Vice President for Policy and Executive Director of the National Urban League. Also joining us today is Gwendolyn Fleming. She is a partner at Van Ness Feldman. She served as both an elected and appointed official at both the state and local level. Hopefully joining us soon is Nicole Clifton of UPS. We'll let you know when she's on board. I'm sad to say that Alex Lasry, who is the Senior Vice President of the Milwaukee Bucks, had planned to join us, but his team sadly lost last night, and so today he is in the air traveling with his team. We're sorry he can't be with us, but he has promised to join us for a future discussion. We'd love to have him because, of course, the Bucks have been at the forefront of the sports conversation about social justice, trying to move that forward. Gwen, I would love to start with you. The law has a diversity problem, particularly at the highest level, but you have been able to make some change in various organizations. Tell us what you've been able to do and what your principal tool or tactic has been for making that change.
Thanks, Jeanne. I wish I could say it was one thing. I think the biggest thing is having the tenacity to not get discouraged. The law, as you said, is one of the places where diversity is lacking, particularly at the top. When you think about managing partners, when you think about executive committees, when you think about equity partners in various firms, and a lot of those decisions are purportedly made based on your book of business. So it relates back to how are you building your client base? Who's introducing you to their client base? A lot of those deals are very often made on golf courses or in rooms where generally people of color have not historically been a part of. And so when you talk about familial relationships and how that drives generational change, we start off at a disadvantage. But I have been blessed in my life. I currently serve on our firm's executive committee. I'm the first African American to do so in our firm's 40-year history. There are several other times where I've been the first in terms of running for elected office as the district attorney in DeKalb County, a place that Scotty is very familiar with in Georgia. And I think what it takes is a willingness to really put yourself out there and recognize that these spaces are the new front lines. Unfortunately, we lost a great hero in John Lewis last month. And he was on the front lines, putting his life on the line. And we've all seen and obviously been educated in his story, but recognizing that that line is still there. It's just in different places, whether it's the boardroom, the partnership track, the election office. And we need all to be willing to step out on that front line and make sure that as we become the first in these positions, that we are not the last. We've really got to drive lasting change in these spaces so that we can create the environments that are more beneficial to folks across the spectrum. And that's really where we have our best work in appreciating diversity. And it helps you vet ideas, make stronger positions, and really worth the effort. So it takes some sacrifice, whether you're a John Lewis or a first in any space, but recognize that you've got folks behind you that are really pushing you forward.
You were able not only to enter these spaces yourselves, but to bring others into these spaces. How did you do it?
Well, I think it's funny, Jeanne, because I was thinking of that the other day when I look at the movement now, and I was tempted to tell folks, this younger generation, they don't get it. They are so emboldened and really want to try to make change. And when I had to do it, you had to be very cautious because people were watching. And if you did something right, in many spaces if you did something wrong, in many spaces you were speaking for your entire race. And that then created a problem where there wouldn't be others behind you. But in my race for district attorney, for example, there was a time in Georgia when I was the only elected female district attorney. Now, starting in January, there will be 7. And that's only over the course of a 10-year plan. So I think part of it is not only that willingness to be on the front line, but demonstrating that it can be done, demonstrating that you and others like you have always had the capability and qualifications to do this job. You only needed the opportunity to be able to demonstrate that on a fair playing field.
Clint, last time we talked, we posed the question, is this a moment or is this a movement that we're in the middle of? And you said, as an optimist, you wanted to say that we were in the middle of a movement.
Yes.
A couple of months later, do you still feel this is a movement? Polling shows that support for social justice has declined a bit.
That's right. And I don't often quote President Trump, but on this one I might. That polls aren't always capturing the right data. There was an article in The Atlantic that I just read recently that said we may be at a point in our nation's history where there's a greater anti-racist sentiment than not. I'm not sure about that. The bigger point, Jeanne, is that there is no Project Warp Speed for the elimination of racism. This is going to be a long and intractable fight. It's encouraging that there are people now, regardless of their race and their national origin and background, who believe that this is a fight worth having. But progress in this area is very slow, and it will be. It's impossible to erase 400 years in the time that it takes to develop a vaccine. We should really gird ourselves for a longer term fight here.
I don't want to make this conversation too American-centric, and I don't want it to get too far into politics. But certainly here in the United States, President Trump has seized on this issue, where before there had been a very positive view overall, I think, in the media and elsewhere of what was happening in terms of demonstrations. He's now talking in terms of law and order. Just last week, he moved to stop diversity training within federal agencies. How is that impacting the corporate sector and how they are viewing these battles? Clint, why don't you take that first?
I'd like to think that corporate America has reached the tipping point. It won't tip back because of a political strategy. There are too many companies who have uttered the words systemic racism and have committed themselves to getting rid of it. I think we've tipped past a point in corporate America where we're no longer just focusing on anti-discrimination. I think we're focusing now on anti-racism. And I think that trend is going to be sustainable regardless of what we may be seeing in the moment politically from the provocateur in chief.
So you don't think that this was just about uttering a slogan, putting out some advertisements, saying the right words? Are you seeing evidence of real change on the corporate scene?
I am, and I have to tell you, as a policy chief for a civil rights organization who I've had 2 Zoom calls just today with trade associations in the automobile industry and another global industry. These folks get it. They're not looking for one-offs. They're not looking to do something that's very high profile and splashy as a public relations matter. I think they're looking to make enduring change, and they're certainly willing to ask the opinions of others as opposed to imposing what they think the solution is. And that's a change. It's a very subtle change, but it's an important one.
Let me tell the audience, we want your questions. There's a Q&A function here on WebEx. Please use it, write in your questions, and I will pose as many of them as we can get to. I also want to now take the opportunity to welcome Nicole Clifton. Nikki's the Vice President of Global Public Affairs at UPS. Great to have you join us.
Thank you so much, Jeanne. I'm sorry for the technical difficulties, but we're in.
Technology could not defeat you. You made it. Thank you very much. Nikki, when we last spoke, you were talking about a very deep and broad commitment by UPS to try and drive the social justice issues. So here we are weeks later. How tough has it been?
You know, I am so thankful that you asked that question, because the reality is it is difficult, even when you've got the acceptance and the approval at the highest levels of your organization. I was just on a call yesterday with our Equity and Justice Task Force, and our CEO, Carol Tomei, joined the call to reinforce the mission, to reinforce the fact that it's not a moment, and to really help give lift to what we're doing. And I think the reason that it's tough is not because folks' hearts aren't in the right place. It's because it's such a sensitive topic that we're just not used to talking about at work. And you've got all the dynamics that bring to bear all of the emotion and all of the things that people come to personally and professionally. And there's still a lot of fear and uncertainty about saying the wrong thing, about how to speak truth to power, and whether or not when you speak, one, whether you're going to be heard, but also whether there'll be some concerns or consequences as an employee. So I think we're doing a lot of trust building and trying to make sure that we move this along authentically.
Clint was just mentioning that this was going to be a long process. Being inside of an organization that's trying to move this, is he right? Is this going to be long? And how long?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball. I wish I did. But I do think it's going to be a long process, but it doesn't need to be an arduous process. I think there's a lot of hope in the fact that companies are leaning in and embracing these conversations. And I frankly think the longer we stay in this moment authentically, the more likelihood we are not to reverse. And so we take these actions deliberately. We come to it from a place of understanding that everyone's not going to agree all at once, and that it may take several times and lots of different thought leadership. But trying to do it in a quick moment, I don't think is the silver bullet.
Are you facing some real resistance from some employees? I'm just thinking, because of the political situation that we find ourselves here in the United States, that there may be some people who are saying, I don't want to talk about this.
Sure. I think there are folks who either don't want to talk about it sometimes, or need some education as to why it's important to be talking about it. Perhaps their vantage point is such that they don't get it, to be honest. Not everyone has a foundation in race-related issues. If it's not their lived experience, they may not resonate with it. And so, sure, an example is we've mandated unconscious bias training for all of our management team. And sometimes folks will say, well, if I take this, does this mean that you're determining that I'm a racist? And so we've got to really help people understand that there's no determination made, that the unconscious bias training is to make you aware of tendencies, and that we all have them. And so I think the resistance is not something we can overcome, but we recognize that it's there and that we have some work to do.
Clint, I want to touch on the Milwaukee Bucks, even though Alex Lastry couldn't be with us here today. They, of course, opted to walk out on one of their playoff games, and it just lit a fire all across the sports world. You saw athletes taking a stand on the issues. How important has that been? Is it just theatrics or does it have real impact?
I thought that was a bold and brave move on the part of the team, and more importantly, the management and the ownership of the team. These things sometimes happen against the wishes of owners and management. This happened with it. And I think it's a perfect example of the power of grass tops in a movement.
What do you mean by that?
So movements have larger than life luminaries who sit atop the fray. In the 60s, we had figures like Dr. King. We have presidents. We have thought leaders. But these are not the people who are on the ground making change in communities. So when you have very privileged athletes who, by all accounts, lead wonderful lives with no financial needs, the American dream, the Canadian dream, just what you dream about as a kid. When these folks start to take action, it grabs the attention of everyday Americans. And maybe you don't like it, maybe you do like it, but it grabs your attention, and it makes it harder to let the moment pass and not participate. Think about the president chimed in. Athletes from other sports chimed in. It actually set off a chain of events that ended up with Naomi Osaka, a Japanese professional tennis player, joining this movement. So to me, it just showed the power of grass tops and the power that these athletes have, that they have not always been willing to flex, and they flexed it in this moment.
Some athletes have in the past, Muhammad Ali, Colin Kaepernick.
Yep.
They paid a high price for being politically active. Is it a demonstration of how different this moment is, that we had a much more widespread reaction from the athletes, and that thus far the negative fallout appears to have been limited?
I think this is somewhat a function of the time that we're in. Muhammad Ali, went to prison for his unwillingness to fight in what he thought was an unjust war. Some of the athletes like Colin Kaepernick, but even before him, the athletes in the 1972 Olympics, I believe, who held their fists in the air, and the Australian who in sympathy, joined in the protest. These men suffered a lifetime of lost earnings and lost reputation. I think we're in a different time, and I think we're in a time that actually values social protest. The contract that Colin Kaepernick got with Nike, although not a contract to play professional football, shows corporate America was standing behind him and the social protest movement.
Gwen, I want to ask you about using the law. We just saw 52 former franchisees of McDonald's sue McDonald's, saying you put us in bad places, you didn't treat us the way you do your white franchisees. How significant is that case in your view?
Oh, I think it's extremely significant, and it's another example of folks not only using new tools, but also binding together to make a greater statement. And I think to Clint's point, that's one of the memorable things that the Bucks started. It allowed space for people then to see how united folks are, so they don't have to feel isolated, one, but then two, that sends an even bigger message that this isn't just one person's concern or one person's issue. These are large scale issues and problems, and they need to be addressed systemically, as opposed to one-offs that don't always get the broad scale change that you hope and need in this moment.
Do you anticipate we'll see other cases like this, and you have any hints on where they'll be coming from?
I do. I think one of the things that this movement is doing, and whether it's with the aid of social media or other ways, it is bringing people together. People are sharing their stories, building new alliances. and joining and rallying around these common desires and wishes. And so I think you're going to see it not only in corporate America with franchises and those types of places, but you'll see it in various other employment settings. You will start to see it. I work in the environmental justice realm, and that's another big topic in terms of ensuring that our communities are treated fairly. And so I think this is just the tip of the iceberg.
Clint, do you agree with that?
I do as well. There's a cautionary note that we should consider. Companies like McDonald's, like a number of companies at the time of George Floyd's murder, really put out some very strong statements in support of Black Lives Matter and their commitment to ending systemic racism. One aspect of the announcement of this lawsuit is that it shows that one can be perfectly committed to ending systemic racism and perhaps have some legacy issues that need to be addressed. Those cannot be hidden. Those have to be brought to the fore, and they have to be explained, and there has to be a level of transparency. I think folks will respect that. This is not a problem that started, on May 25th. It's a problem that predated it, and in many ways, we are all part of that problem. And we shouldn't shy away from either what we don't know or even our past role in perpetuating it. And I, for one, will respect McDonald's when this lawsuit concludes and if there's an issue, that they take accountability for it and continue to be committed to their stated goals.
A reminder to our audience, once again, we'd love your questions. We want this to be a participatory event. So if you could use the Q&A function here to type in your questions for the panelists, that would be absolutely great. Nikki, we were talking a few minutes ago about what I've seen termed white lash, which is the pushback on some of these issues. Do we need to reframe the conversation and reframe it as one of reconciliation? Would that help?
I'm not sure that changing the term would help because in my view, and this is just my personal view, to reconcile, you still have to come to terms with and acknowledge the wrong that has been done. And so in terms of reconciliation, that is still a path that comes with, being educated, acknowledging it, making some sort of either apology or acknowledgement that is meaningful, and then moving through the process of reconciliation. I think even with the term reconciliation, you may get pushback because if you don't fundamentally understand what you're reconciling, then you cannot be on board. And I think that's part of our work, is to really get to that fundamental understanding. And that's what makes it so difficult, is everyone's lived experience just simply has not been the same.
Gwen, the Institute for Corporate Productivity says that 27% of companies are putting their programs relating to diversity and inclusion on hold. How disturbing is that? Does it mean that the pandemic is making it even more difficult to address questions of social equality and social justice?
I think it's very disturbing. And as Nikki was talking, I think one of the things that came to my mind is the problem with white lash or whatever term we want to talk about, is that it's only looking at this issue from a select moment in time, and it fails to recognize the historic implications and events that got us here. In part, to fully understand that history, we have to look at our education system. What are we teaching our children? What was this generation taught as they were growing up? So that's what adds to the complexity of the issue, is to get people to open the aperture and realize that these programs, these trainings are put in place to address historic wrongs. And if you don't know and understand and appreciate that history, then you don't have the full perspective and really can't absorb or appreciate the need for a solution.
We just had a question from Scotty. I think that was from you. Let me see if I can pull that up again. What role can historically Black colleges and universities play? What was the UPS Microsoft program to bring computers to Morehouse all about? Nikki?
Sure. Well, as a proud HBCU grad, I graduated from Howard University, and I think HBCUs and PWIs can also play a role from an education standpoint at getting out this story in the way that Gwen was talking about, really helping folks understand in a way that's digestible the legacy and the story and the education of the African American experience. There is nothing like a historically Black college for that kind of deep education and also to show the stories of success. I think that is so important, and we've seen numerous opportunities to demonstrate that and examples of that, particularly coming out of Howard. I got to give my school a plug. In terms of the UPS Microsoft program, we were really proud to partner with Microsoft to bring the Microsoft Surface tablet to Morehouse College students who were not able to come to campus and who may not have had the technology access to be able to access their programs and their education systems online. And so we delivered for Microsoft to every Morehouse student that was coming to school and actually couldn't come to campus. And so we delivered those computers straight to their homes. And so that was wonderful to be able to support those young men.
Clint, it seems to me we come back to an issue, however. There are ways to learn, whether it be through HBCUs or other kinds of platforms, but people have to be receptive to hearing what's being said.
Absolutely.
Talk to me a little about that.
Well, Gwen and Nikki have talked about this backlash notion, and this backlash is about as American as apple pie. When slavery was eliminated, there was an almost immediate backlash that led to efforts to undo Reconstruction. When the Civil Rights Acts and the Voting Rights Acts in the 1960s were passed, there were actually legal challenges that were filed within moments of these bills being signed by the president. When the first African American president of the United States became president, there was an immediate backlash questioning his citizenship. So backlashes are not, new, but the leadership at the top of an organization and the leadership at the top of a government can make a big difference in tempering that. So I'm actually hopeful that we are in a moment where I can't attribute this to the current president of the United States, but a president of the United States can make a big difference in this. My former boss, since we've all gotten together, Kamala Harris, has joined Vice President Biden's ticket. I'm very proud of her. I'm also very proud of the fact that she is an HBCU alumna.
Howard.
Another Howard. My own parents were not able to go to the college I attended because the law in Louisiana would not allow them to. So they are proud. They were proud HBCU alums of Grambling State and Southern University in Louisiana. But we're also seeing young athletes who would never consider going to an HBCU now going to HBCUs. There was a five-star prospect who just recently announced and is now enrolled at Howard University to play basketball. The opportunity here to really inject new life into what can sometimes be a struggling HBCU system, to show the possibilities of what African American students and other students can do. I was on a Zoom yesterday with David Harris, the president of the American Jewish Committee, who regaled us with some history of HBCUs that I was not aware of, and that is when Jewish professors could not get jobs at major universities, they could oftentimes go to HBCUs and teach and be tenured and practice their craft. There's so much history of HBCUs in this country of which we're not aware. So many famous alums, so many alums that we don't know about. I just think this having Kamala Harris on the ticket can really be a big help to HBCUs.
As you mentioned, the message from the top is important. And the election is looming in the United States. How worried are you about voter suppression in this election cycle? And what do you think of companies like Old Navy, Scotty asks, who are giving workers a paid day off to work the polls? I've also seen that they aren't the only ones doing it. Others are taking similar steps, giving just a day off, whether they're working the polls or just voting. What do you think of those kinds of initiatives? Gwen?
I think they are right on point and right on time. I think that we need to do more to make sure that people are able to exercise a right that many died for. I would not have been elected to office without the sacrifice of John Lewis and so many others during the civil rights movement. And I think, to Clint's point, having the right person at the top makes a huge difference. And in order, at least in the election space, the electoral space, we do that through our voting process. And it's very important to make sure that process is untainted and that it really reflects the diversity of this country. And I think as long as you are barring people from being able to exercise that vote, we will never get to the point where we really have a voting system that speaks for everybody.
And corporations clearly can play some part in increasing participation. We have a question from
Jeanne.
Oh, go ahead, Nikki.
I was just going to say that one of the things that we've seen at UPS that's been really enthusiastically welcomed is we just started a Drive the Vote campaign, and it provides nonpartisan information throughout all the 50 states in terms of helping our employees know where they vote, how to get registered, which states allow for early voting. And we are pushing this information out to them over the next 2 months. We started it last week, and today I just saw the next clip that ran, and our team is constantly pushing this information out. I have not seen, the amount of encouragement and excitement about this. I haven't seen this kind of excitement in a while, and so it's really good, and it's being well received.
And go ahead, Gwen.
No, and I was to compliment what Nikki said. You're also seeing a generational shift. I think with this pandemic, where traditionally you saw older folks at the polls and those types of things, you are now seeing the next generation step up and say, how can we serve? We may not be old enough to vote, but I've seen where now they have 16-year-olds that can come in and be poll workers to make sure that we are operating as a community to protect this very important right.
I would just say, Nikki, as a member of something called the Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity, there is going to be loads of disinformation being distributed via all kinds of social media channels. In particular, UPS is going to have to keep up its efforts right through Election Day to put out proper and correct information for voters.
Yeah, we're committed to doing that.
Is this a new program this year, by the way?
It is. It is brand new, and it is one of the initiatives that came out of the Equity and Justice Task Force, and our employees have really received it quite well, and we're just excited to be able to push that information out, but both voter awareness and also census participation.
We have a question from Lena Trudeau, who asks, in our company, we're attempting to provide opportunities for folks to learn more about systemic racism and how to be anti-racist in a safe, judgment-free way. It is difficult. Do you have any practices you can share? Nikki, you said this is hard. Any specific tips?
It's really hard. What we have found, a couple of things we found. One, to allow some of those conversations to come up organically through, if you've got affinity groups or business resource groups, because we have different ecosystems at UPS. And so we've got operations teams that are largely in our hubs and our centers, and then we've got our corporate audiences, and then we've got folks that are in different parts of the country and different parts of the world. And so when you have as many people as we have, you've got to be, I think, smart about how you bring that information. And sometimes it's from the employees themselves having these conversations. We also have brought in speakers, and one of the things that we're really excited about in the next couple of weeks is that Brian Stevenson is going to join our executive leadership conference to speak about his work. And so I think being purposeful about your speaker series, but then also giving your employees the space and the opportunity to be able to have those conversations is really important. And then get outside help if you can. We're doing this stuff for the first time in many instances in such an intentional way. And so sometimes that outside resource can be helpful depending on what your ecosystem is like.
And of course, you're having to do it in a virtual way. What I've read is that Black and Hispanic employees are feeling more isolated than they have in the past because of this reliance on the internet for communication. Clint, do you have any thoughts on that?
It's a real thing. I manage a multicultural team of about 8 people, and I spend a lot of my time checking in on people. There are some people who are not thriving in this environment. In the pre-pandemic space, they were quite capable, competent. People are struggling. And I think this goes to a larger issue, especially in African American and Latino communities, of mental health. We are not arriving at this moment simply dealing with a pandemic. We've been dealing with the weathering effects of racism and for quite some time. So when you combine the isolation of COVID, especially given the high susceptibility and the high mortality rate that people of color face, when you combine that with just the same weathering effects of racism, we've got a real public health crisis. I mean, people have described racism as a public health crisis, but the weathering effects of racism, are creating their own mental and physical health crises. Absolutely.
One of the things that, if I can add, one of the things that we found is the benefit of those conversations that Nikki talks about is it allows people to tell their story in a safe space. So hopefully the colleagues that you've worked with now realize that it's something that doesn't happen to other people that are on TV, but it's happening to people that I work with every day. And whether, to Clint's point, whether it's the worry of an elderly parent, whether it's the concern whether your sons will make it home at night, whether it's what are people going to say now that I'm not able to get my hair done on a regular basis. All that may seem trivial, but it goes to your notion of self-worth and being able to share and have others learn from your experience helps build sort of the common binds that we're hoping will help us all get through this. And one other suggestion that we're exploring at our firm is bystander training. You've heard about microaggression training, unconscious bias training, but this allows people to stand in the gap when they witness someone being discriminated against or being the victim of a microaggression. And it does 2 things. One, it lets the victim know that they are not alone, but it also lets the offender know that this will not be tolerated. And so people feel as though they can now do something as opposed to continually wondering, how do I make this better? I don't know who to reach out to or how to improve things. I want to help, but I just don't know how.
Hey,
Nikki,
Jeanne, can I just add really quick on just to piggyback on what Gwen was saying? One of the things that we found really helpful is to have these conversations, let's say around 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and it's more around someone's career. So it's offering an African-American leader in our organization that may be talking about career development or networking with a purpose. And then these conversations around race and the issues that Black folks are facing in the corporate office inevitably come up. But the conversation is meant to bring people together to see a leader in the company who is doing well, but then also hear from that person about how they move through the organization. So you're offering both a benefit, but also personal insights. And we've had some of our employees come in and they DJ, they have music. It's like a little virtual happy hour. And like I said, they created it. It was very organic. The corporate officers didn't come in and say, this is how it has to be done. We just, they had the space to do this and we jump on and support it. And so I think you have to let your organization's culture dictate how some of these conversations are carried, but know that it needs to be a priority.
Nikki, last time we spoke, you talked about how important it was to empower diverse voices within an organization. I'm wondering, when you're having these big virtual meetings, is there a reluctance on the part of some African American and Latino participants to speak up, to make themselves heard and visible in that very weird virtual space that we're all having to live in now?
I think I'm seeing less and less reluctance. I'm not going to say that, in the beginning, there definitely was reluctance. And so, we created an equity@ups.com email address so that people could send in questions, and so that we could kind of help, sort of break the ice based on some of the questions that we were getting. And you could see sometimes folks would say things in the chat, but maybe their camera would be off. And so that kind of signaled to me that there is still concern, because it's still work, right? And
Nikki,
so
don't give away all of our secrets. You can't tell people that we're private messaging and off a video. Please don't do that. They're going to take it away from us. They're not going to let us chat.
Look, I'm trying to help this become a common conversation, and I think the more people realize that the company doesn't explode after having these conversations, the easier, it will be to keep having them, because, we need to be able to have a place to feel safe. And I don't know how else to do it, to let people know that there's a trusted space that they can talk.
A reminder again to the audience that we'd love your questions. Put them in Q&A and we will get to them. I'd like to go through some of the techniques that we talked about last time, because some of our viewers may not have participated then, but I also want to get a sense of whether there's been any progress in the intervening weeks. One of the most important things that we talked about, I think, was the pipeline. And this, I think those of you who participated last time view this as a bit of a myth. That it isn't so much a pipeline problem, but a recruitment problem. Gwen, in your space, are you seeing some advancement on that particular issue? Are things changing?
Slowly, but yes. One of the policies that we instituted actually before this year was that every position needs to be funneled through our recruiting committee and posted on a broad array of different organization sites. So it limits the notion of, well, I know somebody from my circle and I want to bring them in from this position, and then there's no real competition, certainly not broad-based competition. So we're starting to see more success in that space, and we're hoping that it'll catch on.
Clint, Nikki, do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, when I was in the Senate, there was a very popular resolution that passed just about every Congress, calling for corporate America, calling for the United States Senate to adopt the so-called Rooney Rule, which is a rule that, it's the rule that Nikki and Gwen have just described. If you're going to compete for a position, it must be posted in a place where not just your friends can access it. And more importantly, people of color must be interviewed for the role. I think the times call for probably a more nuanced or more focused Rooney Rule, but this notion of eliminating the spoils system, or the system where you get a job because of who you know, has to come to an end. The things that we're talking about here are not just equity issues because it's the right thing to do. It's also a business competitive issue. You're not getting the best people, or if you are going to the same well in hiring people who think just like you do and behave just like you do. That competitive advantage can only be obtained by a broad pool of candidates.
We talked about hiring specifically at the CEO level and at the board level. My LinkedIn feed would indicate to me there has been some progress since last time we talked. It seems to be on a daily basis, I'm seeing more and more people who've been tapped, who are people of color, who've been tapped to lead organizations or be on boards. Is my anecdotal experience, does it ring true to the three of you?
I think it does. I know of another African-American partner that I've interacted with and known for the last 20 years that just got an invitation to join his firm's executive committee. And so while you don't want to think these are just token measures, I think having the right folks in the room will open the door for future change.
I agree with Gwen, and I definitely have seen both advancement at UPS, but also externally with friends and colleagues. And I think Gwen hit the nail on the head with respect to making sure that they're not token appointments and making sure that we're really building that sustainable pipeline, because that's what's going to keep making sure that the numbers are where they need to be with talented folks who can continue to represent for years to come. So I think that's where we still need to have work to do to continue to build that pipeline.
Go ahead, Clint.
No, I hope that the anecdotal account matches, numbers that can be tracked. I don't know if I said it last time, but one of my favorite business quotes is Peter Drucker. It says, "You can't manage it if you can't measure it," and we've got to be able to apply metrics and intentionality to these efforts, so that we can make sure that they are bearing fruit. Name one aspect of a business that's run today without metrics and without, even in some cases, tying compensation to achieving those metrics.
A question about metrics. If you rely on them too much, does it become just a check the box exercise, or do you think they truly are effective when you've tied compensation and promotion to them?
Well, let me try it this way. So there are certain industries that have been successful in creating diversity in their corporate and in employment ranks, and some who have not. And among those who have not, there are a whole cast of reasons. But when you are, now we have $1 trillion market cap companies out there. When you reach $1 trillion in market cap and you still cling to the old canard that, we just can't find anybody, or we've got 5% of our worldwide workforce that are people of color or African American or what have you. To me, it says you're not trying. I'm far less concerned about the prospect that someone could say, Titan Corporation with 3% global African American employee base is hiring Black people and is trying to get to 4%. I'm not nearly as concerned about the optics relating to that, but these things can be done. We're curing cancer. We're sending vehicles to Mars. You can't tell me that in this environment, without the right effort and attention, you can't achieve something as modest as this.
Nikki, last time we spoke, again, we talked a lot about political action and the fact that UPS did operate in that space, trying to drive change. Mm-hmm. Have priorities changed in the last several weeks? Have new initiatives been started?
So our priorities have not changed. In fact, they've probably expanded, if anything, with the Drive the Vote campaign, but also the successful urging of the Georgia state legislature to pass the hate crimes bill. And so we've also been continually urging advocacy in South Carolina, in Arkansas, and Wyoming, and then also looking at other areas that we can be impactful and that we can be supportive. And so I think we're really trying to analyze, number one, where does our voice matter the most? Where do we have those legislative connections? Where do we have the most people that are resonating with this message? And then also, how do we connect the priorities to the mission of the company? And so I think we continue to be, from a political standpoint, very active in making sure that we're advancing equity and justice.
Gwen, as someone who's been in the political system as a local and state official, how important is corporate activity in this realm?
I think it's It's very important. And again, it's a new world for me. I spent 25 years in public service, but I've seen where corporations can drive the change that government is sometimes slow to enforce. So when you think about regulations, when you think about standards and those kinds of things, I see it in the environmental space, but also the diversity space. Corporations are the ones that are saying, because of the innovation, we want to be an industry leader and we are going to push the envelope. We've got the resources to invest to be able to make the sort of systemic and sustainable change that we want to see. And sometimes government is just slow to the mark and really is short on resources to be able to drive change. Obviously, they have their place and government has had its place across history, but this is really a partnership effort. Really, no one segment of our country is responsible. There's an opportunity for all of us to pull together, use our gifts and various resources in a way that really supports everybody.
Scotty, a question for you. We've hit 3 o'clock, but we started a little late. Shall we go on a little more? Is that okay with you?
Well, I want to be respectful of everybody's time. If there's 1 or 2 more questions coming through, I think we could go for 5 minutes. But after that, I know people are back-to-back booked for things. So maybe 5 minutes if that works, but I wouldn't go much past that.
Okay. Here's a question I want each one of you to answer. Strategic advice. What strategic advice would you give to organizations in Canada and the US on how they should approach this issue now? What should be their top priority? What should be their approach? Clint, do you want to take that first?
Take that.
Oh, okay, Nikki, go for it.
I'll jump in. I'm sorry, Clint. One, I think it's important strategically to keep listening to your employees. I think you've got to hear what your employees have to say, and whether that's through pulse surveys or smaller focus groups, really get the heartbeat of where your employees are on this issue, because sometimes employees may be tired. If the Black employees may be tired of carrying the message on this, and so it may be incumbent upon you to find other allies that can help to ease those burdens. And so I think listen to the employees. 2, really think into the most important resources. You've got to capitalize this movement. And so make sure that once the employees tell you what they need, that there's a budget undergirding that so that it can be sustainable. And then 3, find measures of accountability that Clint spoke about. I think that what gets measured matters is critical. And so finding those measures of accountability, I think, is the way to make sure that you've got lasting change.
Clint, why don't you go next?
I would agree with that. And I was going to start where Nikki ended. I think it is very important to be able to build these measures or accountability into the performance standards for various folks. Reward the behavior that you want to see, whether that's through comp, promotions, or other things, and create disincentives for the behavior you do not want to see. The other thing I recommend is hiring people in the right places. I think we can all speak to places in our organization where there are pockets of diversity, but perhaps it's not at the top. Perhaps it's not among the lawyer levels or in other key decision-making or policy-making spaces. And so you've got to have diversity everywhere, not just in one segment of the company.
Clint?
I will quote a great Canadian who said, "Skate to where the puck is going to be." That's the best advice that I could give to a company who's trying to figure out what to do in this moment. We saw this moment coming years ago. Maybe the focus groups and the polling said it wasn't the right time. Maybe the comfort level of executives was not there. But if we know where this is all going, and it's not hard to find out, go there now and let the rest of your competitors follow. And we'll get this thing done a lot faster.
Great place to end the conversation. Thank you all. Clint Odom of the National Urban League, Nicole Clifton of UPS, and Gwendolyn Fleming, Van Ness Feldman. Thank you to the three of you for giving us your insights and your experience. Gary, do you want to make a few closing observations?
Thanks, Jeanne. Well, I'd like to echo your comments and just thanking our three outstanding panelists. I don't know if you guys consider yourselves to be role models, but you are. And I think your comments today have shown what I like to call the next generation, since I'm at that age, that there is a next generation. I'm no longer part of that generation. That there is something to shoot for, and goals are achievable and goals can be set. And I think by having these types of discussions, that generation is seeing that there is a path forward, and that path forward can include them. So once again, I thank you all for participating today. Jeanne, thank you once again for doing a great job moderating. And I hope the audience has enjoyed this as much as I have. And hopefully they'll join us again for another session on this at a later date. Thank you.
Great.
Yeah. And I should say with that, we are concluded.
Thank you, Gary.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Take care.
Thanks everyone.
See everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.